to my noble band of outlaws. Outlaw Samurai coming at you live in the video. You're wondering about the noise. There's a fan in the back because I don't have AC, so there's that. Oh, as you have guessed by the title of the video, which is better? Two-sword style or one-sword style? I will be giving my personal opinions on this topic. You may agree, you may disagree. But, without further ado, let's get started, shall we? Now, I will start with one-sword style. I will tell you the pros and the cons of the one-sword style, and then I will move on to the two-sword style. So, let's do this. Okay, so in pop culture, movies, fantasy, anime, we always see people using one sword most of the time. And we even see historically, in example, German longsword. And for the longest time in Japan, we've always seen people use one sword. Why is that? Well, swords are not exactly light weapons, okay? After swinging around a piece of steel for a while, your arms start to get fatigued. And one sword is actually the easiest form of swordsmanship to learn how to use. I would want to wager, I guess, that if you were to join your local Kenjutsu, which is Japanese sword fighting, or HEMA, which is European sword fighting. HEMA stands for Historical European Martial Arts. If you were to join your local HEMA school, then you would probably get started off on German longsword. And the reason it's German longsword, for the most part, is because the manuscripts and the treatises from basically the instruction book of how to fight with swords, I believe most of them come from Germany, and German longsword is very proficient. But in any case, with that in mind, why do you always see people use one sword? Well, as I said, it's easier to use one sword than it is to use two. But the pros, now that I'm giving you a little history on the subject, let's move into the pros of one sword style. It's easy to learn, that's one part. It only takes around a year to completely learn the basics of single sword style, and then you can actually start to get into more complex techniques, such as basically the flourishes that I'm displaying take a while to completely learn how to master. But yes, there are multiple guards for this, like for example, Wrath Guard, Ox Guard, stuff like that. But yes, it's very easy to learn. The next pro of using a single sword is power and leverage. With a two-handed single sword, and I know that's a bit confusing because there is single-handed sword and then there's two-handed sword, or arming sword and long sword if you want to use the Elmsley typologies. But I'm using katana for this, but this is actually my tachi. This is actually my wooden tachi sword. But in any case, with that in mind, it works for my purposes. Now, with that in mind, this sword here is, well, wood. But it is relatively long. It is a longish sword. Now, back onto the main topic. Using a single sword is actually better for power and leverage, because when you cut, with a single-handed sword, your left hand, it's the non-dominant hand that powers the cut, and your right hand, well, it's your right hand that begins the cut, and your left hand brings guidance. However, you can also power the cut with your left hand by pushing with your right and pulling with your left. This creates a fulcrum in the middle of the grip that allows the tip of the blade, where you want to cut with, is around here on a sword, which allows this to hit with a lot of power and a lot of force. Now, with that in mind, leverage and power in swordsmanship, I know a lot of people out there, they think, oh, swordsmanship, okay, it's all about brute strength, especially with HEMA, historical European martial arts, because when people think, okay, longsword, okay, it's going to be knights and an armor, the swords are completely blunt, they're just bashing each other with steel clubs. That is a huge misconception that a YouTuber named Shadiversity completely debunked. Okay, European swords were not dull. Okay, true, there were different degrees of sharpness for a European sword, and it all depended on what you were going to use it for. If you had a sword where you were just walking around town, melandering like this, you were just walking around town, and you knew that you weren't going to come up against anyone in plate armor, but you were going to come up against somebody with, like, maybe a gambeson, which is very thick cloth armor, then yeah, you're going to want a very acute, very sharp sword in order to cut through that armor. The gambeson. Gambeson is not necessarily easy to cut through, but the sharper your blade is, the better you're going to cut it. But if you're on a battlefield where you have a sword with a very, very acute, fine edge, and you start bashing it against metal armor, yeah, your sword will become a club soon, very soon. But, and that was the same in Japan, actually. Swords that were used on the battlefield usually had a niku, and I hope I pronounced that right, considering I'm a giant Japanese sword freak. And what a niku is basically a Japanese sword usually had an edge geometry similar to this. Similar to this. A very much triangular edge at some points. Well, actually, it was more, think more of like a diamond, where up here would be kind of like this, and that would be you. And even with Japanese swords, and being extremely sharp, samurai did wear armor in the battle. They wore iron armor. Granted, there were more holes in a samurai's armor because samurai were mounted archers and spearmen rather than a sword. In actuality, the katana for Japanese samurai on the battlefield was a backup weapon. Just like the M16 is the main weapon for a U.S. soldier, and his 9mm service handgun is his backup. The samurai would have used spears called yari, or bows called yumis, and their swords would be their backup weapon. That would be the melee weapon if their yari broke, or they got into a situation where they couldn't use it. They would throw it away and grab the sword. Now, with that in mind, it's the same in European martial arts. The longsword had different variations, and so did the katana. Now, the niki of a katana, nikyu, I hope I pronounced that right, is actually a little thickening of the edge, where instead of that perfect diamond-shaped edge, where it's very much straight like this, it actually convex a little. It actually convexes itself a little bit. Think convex edge. Yes, the Japanese sword even had even the Japanese figured out that the convex edge is better for heavy cutting because it has more meat on the edge, more material to support the cutting edge than the traditional, very acute edge that the Japanese sword is known for. Well, in any case, with that in mind, the one sword style is most proficient because it is most used. Because of the edge geometries of swords, that's how they cut. And even when you're on the battlefield, European swords, for example, the longsword, it wasn't sharp all the way down as most people think. Most longswords only started to get sharp about 6 inches from the guard. Some were actually left half blunted, and that was so you could perform a technique called half swording easier, where you put one hand on the blade, you have another hand on the grip, and you thrust. This gives you a lot of control and a lot more power in the thrust. And this technique was developed specifically to go for the very small gaps in European armor. For example, my what the heck? I don't even. For the longest time, this was called a Muscle Man T-shirt or whatever. My shirt here is very reminiscent of a breastplate, where I would actually be exposed underneath my armpits, and there are actually very much vital arteries underneath it that could cause you to bleed out. Knights knew this, so instead of holding your arms up like this when you were in full armor, they tended to keep their arms down, because the outside of their arms would be completely covered in armor, and they'd be able to fight. Now, with that in mind, leverage and power, even against knights, were very important, because there were some swords that were, great swords. There was the Scottish Claymore, there was the German Zweihander, the English Greatsword. Those were called anti-polar weapons. So, a sword capable of fighting against a spear, and they were true two-hander swords. They couldn't use. I got a text from a friend of mine, BJ Yoho, Geekopedia, source of all geekdom, YouTube channel. If you're a subscriber to my channel, I suggest you subscribe to him. You can probably find him in my channel section on my channel's page or whatever the hell it is. I don't know. I don't know how YouTube works. I don't really know the inner workings of YouTube. It's the Illuminati. But in any case, with that in mind, the point of the longsword in that regard was to kill your opponent, and you need leverage and power in order to perform specific cuts and abilities. So I know I went into a little bit of a tangent there, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to try to get back on the main topics. Alright, so I covered ease of use, leverage and power. Next, I'm going to cover another pro of the single sword style. And that is, well, it's easy to predict, because say you're facing an opponent, and you both studied the same longsword style. For example, German longsword, and but he studied a different version of German longsword than you. Don't matter. Single sword techniques are universal. So you could easily predict what he's going to do based on your own training and your own experience. So if he comes in here like out of Wrath Guard, then you're instantly going to be like, okay, he goes into Wrath Guard, he's probably going to do a diagonal slash, so I need to step to the side of his slash and thrust. Or I could parry his slash downwards off my blade, then bring it around and go for his neck. all valuable techniques. They're all very much valid techniques. However, as I said, it's easy to predict, but it's also very easy to use, in the sense that its weight. The weight of a sword is very much crucial to how it handles. The heavier the sword, the slower you're actually going to be able to swing it. Although there is a trade-off. Heavy swords grant more power, but lighter swords grant more speed. So, with that in mind, strength does play a crucial role in swordsmanship. If you are physically stronger than your opponent, then you could actually use a slightly heavier sword than your opponent, and the speed difference not be that crucial. It's like maybe only a few seconds off your opponent's speed, but you use a heavier sword that could keep them at bay, and it's harder for them to break through your defenses. That's very much crucial in swordsmanship. It's a give and take relationship. But with that in mind, the weight of a sword is very much dependent on how it's forged, but when you're using a sword, especially a long sword, look at this. You have enough room on the grip. You like that out there, you pervs. I had to do what Scalagrim does. It's like, I always wanted to pull a Scalagrim parody in my videos, and if you know Scalagrim, you'll get the joke. But in any case, you have enough room to put two hands on the grip, and you can actually swing with a lot more control than you would have with one hand. You can control the blade a lot better. And not only that, but the weight of the sword is actually distributed between your two hands. This sword, I doubt even weighs 1.5 pounds. But the weight is still distributed evenly between my left hand and my right hand. The weight is distributed so I can use the sword longer without feeling tired. Cons. Like, I think I've talked about enough pros of the sword. Now for the cons of the long sword. Well, I should mention one more pro, so I don't. So I remember. I'm doing this off my own memory. I didn't rehearse this or anything. I don't rehearse my videos. I just make them. So with that in mind, the long sword has one big advantage. See what that is? You're not seeing it, are you? You're not getting what I'm saying, are you? See? See how far away I am from you? Bing, bing! You got it, people. Reach. With a long sword, you have more reach to perform certain techniques and attacks than your opponent. And the longer your sword, the farther away you can be from your opponent and still strike them. So, the reach of a long sword is very much superior than a short sword. Now, for the cons of the long sword. There are cons to this. The con of the long sword is inevitably the long sword itself. And what I mean by that is, not every long sword is the same. Some are good, some are bad. Some are hideously underly designed and just slapstick shit together. Some are very beautiful and elegant. I'm talking about Albion here, for example. But in any case, with that in mind, the sword, the cons of the long sword are its weight, for one example. Because if you get a long sword from a very reputable swordsmith, then yes, it's going to be a very good sword that has good balance, good weight. But if you get one from a back alley swordsmith that don't know what the hell he's doing, it's going to be a big clunky bar of steel that's just shaped like a blade. Has no real cutting diameter at all. Damn it, can't say it. Characteristics. It has no cutting characteristics at all. It's just a big ass blunt piece of shit steel. So that's another thing, it's weight. If it's not forged correctly and if it's not ground correctly, it's going to be extremely heavy. Con number 2, the predictability of a longsword, especially if you practice a German longsword like most HEMA practitioners do. I think 99% of them. But in any case, with that in mind, there's not much difference between schools when it comes to German longsword. Okay? You could have one school called Fortune Cookie School, for example, and another school called Ramen School. And one school teaches you to perform Wrath Guard like this, and another school teaches you to perform Wrath Guard like this. Like the Fortune Cookie School over here teaches you to perform Wrath Guard like so. The Ramen School teaches you to perform Wrath Guard like so. Not much difference considering the fact that even if you do it here or here, you're still, either way you do it, Wrath Guard is Wrath Guard. You're not going to come up with a new form of Wrath Guard, unless maybe you do it like this. So, I really feel like this is more like Hollywood shit. But, in any case, with that in mind, you're not going to find much difference between the longsword school and the short sword. I mean, not the long and short sword. I mean the Ramen School and the Fortune Cookie School, because they are both German longsword. It's very predictable. And with that in mind, that's another con, predictability. And there's another con that I should mention, and that is the double edge. I'm not a fan of double-edged swords, especially if they're sharp, because that way there's an edge pointing directly at me. And I get the utilitarian purpose behind two edges. If one gets blunt, you can switch to the other, or you can blunt one and then switch to the other. I shall be right back. Sorry about that. But in any case, with that in mind, I do get the utilitarian purpose of using having two edges on a sword. And historically, if I think this was done historically, they would blunt one edge of the sword and leave the other one sharp, and that was for like parrying the techniques. But it requires a lot of skill to use the parrying edge, and then once your opponent is open, switching to the sharp edge and cutting. But yes, I do feel like the double edges is a con on a long sword. But that's just my personal con. Just for the simple fact that if a double-edged sword isn't designed right, I just don't like it aesthetically. It's my aesthetic. It's not aesthetically pleasing to me as a katana is. But in any case, with that in mind, there's not a lot of cons I can really think of off the top of my head for a single-handed, and I keep trying to say single-handed sword. I meant single sword style. Or Itoryu if you're Japanese. If you practice Japanese martial arts. So, yeah. In conclusion, for beginners, single sword is best to learn, especially longsword, because the techniques are relatively simple starting out, and they just progressively get more complicated, and you can increase your skill relatively quickly with a single sword use. But again, that's just my personal critique. But yeah. So with that in mind, that's what I believe would be best for a single-handed sword to be used for. Is to be used, not single-handed sword, to be used by beginners. And especially considering the fact that if you learn correctly and you learn how to use the sword, one-handed swordsmanship is, one sword style is extremely good. I'm not dissing it or anything. I myself practiced the longest time in single sword. I created my own martial arts system, my own sword style. But with that in mind, I very much do like one sword style. And while there are pros and cons, it's to be given and to be taken with a grain of salt, especially my opinions. So that takes care of single sword. Alright. Next we move to two sword style, or twin sword style, or Nitoryu, or two sword style in Japanese. Now, most people when they think two sword style, they think Leonardo from TMNT, or Miyamoto Musashi from Japan, who actually invented the Nitoichi Ryu, which translates to two heavens combining as one. And he also wrote the Book of Five Scrolls, or Five Rings. Yeah, Five Rings. But most people, when they think two-sword style, they think, okay, badass swinging around, doing fancy flips and stuff, blocking like this. This is actually Hollywood, because the crossed swords just look cool. However, a blog like this, yeah, that's Hollywood, anime, and pop culture. If you were to block like this, then yes, this would be feasible. And the swords do look crossed, but as you can see, they're not. So if you were to have a sword come from down here, and you had your swords like this, you could block and push with both your arms. Sorry. But in any case, with that in mind, what are the pros of the two-sword style? Well, before I do that, I have to give you the history behind a lot of two-sword style, just like I did with a longsword. Historically, in Europe, when people think European martial arts, they think longsword or rapier, or even sword and buckler, or shield and sword. But there was actually a two-sword style used in Europe. In Europe, it was called dual wielding. But what they did was, in Europe, when you dual wielded, you would use a rapier in one hand and a parrying dagger in the other hand. And what I mean by a parrying dagger is it would usually be about maybe 2 feet long, or 18 feet long. Not 18 feet, 18 inches. And it looked like a European scythe, basically. And you had the main prong going up, and then you had the 2 forks. And the parrying dagger was round because you would hold it like this and used to parry your opponent's blade, which means get it out of the way for your sword to come in and strike. In Japan, it was a little different. The one who created the Japanese two-sword style was Miyamoto Musashi, the greatest swordsman to ever have lived in Japan. Okay, he has been credited to be the greatest swordsman Japan has ever had. And he created the Nitoichi Ryu, the two-sword style. That's where we get the word Nitoryu, which means two-sword style. And with that in mind, what Musashi did was basically take the Japanese daisho, which were, you had a long sword in your belt and you had a short sword in your belt, like so. And the samurai would always fight with the long sword, leaving the short sword behind in the belt. What Musashi thought of, because traditionally the wakazaki, the Japanese accompanying short sword, what Miyamoto did was, I'm carrying 2 swords. why should I only use one? So he got to thinking. It's like, what if I started using my shorter sword to fight along with my long sword? And that's exactly what he did. He started to use both swords in tandem. So he then created the Nito Ichiryu, the two heavens combining as one. Now, some of the pros of two-sword style. First of all, two swords. So that means you can fight multiple opponents. Sure, you can do the same with one-sword style, but it's a lot more difficult. So, let's say I have an opponent here, and I have an opponent there. Alright? My opponent over here, he comes slashing at me low. My opponent over here comes slashing at me high. I can block both their slashes. And then, I can kind of manipulate my way through them and either get away or get some space to turn and fight them. Now, with that in mind, true, most two-sword styles don't use swords of the same length. But this is my two-sword style. Usually you'd have a short sword and a long sword. I like two long swords when I use two-sword style, just for the reach. But, in any case, with that in mind, the two-sword style allows you to fight multiple opponents at the same time. That's one major pro of the sword style. Pro number 2. Two swords. Which means, and I'm not repeating my pros here, I mean two swords in the sense that if one sword breaks, then you could throw it away, draw another sword. Or if one sword is dull, you can use the other sword. So, that's what I mean by two swords. Now, another pro of the two-sword style is, and I know I'm not going into as many rambling tangents as I did in the beginning. I'm trying to condense it. But, in any case, another pro of the two-sword style is you don't need to use both swords. Okay? Two-sword style is mainly for when you fight multiple opponents. Or, you want to kill an opponent, or you want to kill a single opponent quickly. You can actually just use one sword, and that way you can fight, and if it's not a serious duel, you just sheath the blade, go on. But if it gets serious, then you can always, and you need a little extra edge, pun intended, you can pull out your sword, and that way you have two swords to fight with. Now, another, I want to say pro of the two-sword style is, well, the two-sword style is actually my favorite sword style, and even though I'm not very proficient in it as of yet, I am trying to get better at it. But there's one thing, I really don't want to go into the cons, because there's a lot more cons with two-sword style than there is one-sword style. But I have to give cons to the two-sword style, just as I did with the one-sword. So, with that in mind, two-sword style actually has a lot more cons than the one-sword style. First of all, it takes longer to learn. What you can learn in 1 year with with one-sword style, you can barely get halfway through with two-sword style. And what I mean by that is, when you're using one sword, both your hands are on one single blade, so you can maneuver it, and all you have to do is worry about two swords. Your sword and your opponent's sword, and you can maneuver it to counter. With two-sword style, you have to take into account three swords. Your opponent's single sword and your two swords. So you actually have to learn how to manipulate both your arm. You actually have to learn how to transition between single sword use and two sword use. You actually have to transition between using your left and right hand very quickly. So yes, it takes longer to learn and it requires more skill to do so. However, there's another con. And it goes back to what I said about the longsword and the weight. The weight of the swords, it's not distributed between two hands anymore. The weight, your right hand and your left hand are both taking the full weight of a single sword. So you're actually fatigued quicker. So you need more physical strength to use two sword style as effectively as a single sword stylist would use. But with that in mind, there's another pro I forgot to mention: defense. As I stated, two sword style gives you a lot of defensive ability. Now, as I say, the pro is defense, the con is attack, and that's the con of the longsword. It doesn't give you as much defensive ability as it does attack ability. But the two sword style suffers in raw attack power. It makes up with defensive power because you have two swords to block your opponent. So it's really hard for them to get past. If they get past one sword, then they have to get past the other sword, and it just gets progressively harder to get past them if the two sword stylist is highly skilled. But yeah. Another con of the two-sword style is, I really don't want to say this, but the two-sword style itself. And what I mean by that is, the two-sword style isn't perfect, okay? Neither is one-sword style. No sword style is inherently perfect. However, the two-sword style does have a lot more weaknesses in terms of the physical abilities of the swordsman than the one sword style. Now you actually have to train physically more to use two swords. But I forgot to mention another, but it's kind of a pro and it's also a con combined. Generally, when you use two swords, they're shorter swords. And what I mean by that is, compare the lengths of these swords. You can see, well, the length isn't all that significant. The differences in the length between this sword and this sword is a few inches. I generally use a little longer sword than what should be used for two-sword style. I myself personally do like a longer sword. It's just I use what would be considered just a little long, about maybe 3 or 4 inches longer than what you would use with a two-sword style. Generally, you would use swords about 40 inches long for the two-sword style. I use swords, both of these swords are 48 inches long, so they're both 4 feet long. And with that in mind, I actually use longer swords than you would traditionally use. Except in the Europeans' case, when they used a 58-inch rapier. Yeah. Over 40 inches of blade and only about 6 inches of grip. But with that in mind, it's actually very easy to maneuver and slash effectively. Now, I say pro and con because